Welcome, everybody. At Communitech, we're working hard to bring you businesses virtual as much as possible while also supporting our members the best we can. Before we kick things off, I would like to take a moment to thank all of our courageous frontline workers for everything that they are doing for our community right now. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our Ask Me Anything session today. My name is Stacy Sobring. I'm the investment specialist here at Communitech. I'm very excited to have Frank Erschen join us today for a look at how to pitch and raise investment post-pandemic. Before I turn it over to Frank, I have a few quick housekeeping items I'd like to share. Number one, just a reminder that this session is being recorded, so it can be shared at a later date with our companies. You can find all of our Ask Me Anything recordings on our Tech Talks page at communitech.ca. You may want to minimize your speaker view on the right-hand side of your screen in order to view Frank's entire screen as he shares his slide deck. I ask that you please keep your microphone on mute during the session. Please use the chat functionality to ask any questions you have throughout the session. We'll have a couple of different designated Q&A times throughout the presentation, at which time we'll look to the chat to answer the questions that you've posted. If you're interested in following up after the session to discuss this topic further, please connect with either your Communitech advisor or CSM. They can connect you directly with Frank, or you can reach out to Frank through his LinkedIn. Lastly, Communitech is running Ask Me Anything sessions Tuesday at 2 p.m. You'll see some of our upcoming sessions listed here on the slides. With that, I will turn it over to Frank.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's really good to be here. The main focus for today is going to be pitching for investment, but I'll be covering other types of pitching as well. And following today's session, I'm going to provide a copy of this presentation to Communitech for distribution. So you'll have a copy of it from them later. Some of you are participating from outside the Waterloo area, and I'd be happy to do a similar session for entrepreneurs in your region. So by all means, I'd be happy to do that. I'm going to start by reflecting on territorial acknowledgement. Over the past several years, I've learned a great deal from Indigenous entrepreneurs with whom I've worked. And I begin today by acknowledging the land on which we gather as the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of Scugog, Hiawatha and Alderville First Nations, and the Métis Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The treaties that were signed for this particular parcel of land are collectively referred to as the Williams Treaties of 1923. I know many of you are participating from other areas, and I encourage you to take the time to learn about and acknowledge the Aboriginal land from which you participate. I also want to give sincere thanks to, shout outs and thanks to all the essential services workers for what they've done, and to Communitech for hosting today and being an exemplar in today's very strange world. So thank you to both groups. This objective for today is about giving you some insight to the kinds of barriers and opportunities that you would have as a pitcher, whether it's for investment or sales or other things, considering what's happened with COVID-19. So I'll talk about the barriers and opportunities, how you overcome them and embrace them, and then eventually lead to what you do from a pitch strategy and content point of view, whether you're looking at investment, selling, partnership, or talent. I also want to clarify what today is not about. This is not about a session on developing your pitch story and deck. I have separate workshops and one-on-ones to cover these. Today, I'm very focused on what COVID-19 means to anyone who is pitching. I'm going to go through 2 sprints of presentations with Q&A at the end of both. The second one is going to get to the heart of the matter about post-COVID pitching, but it really requires the first, which talks about context and shifting from reactive to proactive, to set the stage for talking about pitching. So I'm going to start with some context. The world is forever different, but it's important to know this crisis isn't the first and won't be the last. If you look at history, go all the way back to the 1300s, you had the Great Famine and the Black Plague, which were hugely impactful to the world at the time. Black Plague alone had 75 to 200 million deaths in Eurasia and North Africa. World War II, if you look at more recent history, 30 countries at war, 75 to 85 million people died. And not that long ago, and many of us will remember this, is the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, which sparked the Great Recession. But it's not just about these crises. And COVID-19, we know it started in 2020, arguably 2019, but we don't know when it's going to end. And this is really about a global pandemic and global disruption. But let's look at beyond the crises. So the famine and Black Plague, despite how impactful they were to the world, they were followed by the Renaissance, which is really the foundation for the world that we live in today. If you look at World War II, after World War II, there was a post-war boom or booms, where you had housing, the baby boom, the highway booms, all kinds of economic booms that happened since World War II. The global financial crisis, not that many years ago, which really hit everybody very, very hard. But if you look at this graph, which shows the S&P 500 since then, it's just been soaring. And in fact, it's the longest economic expansion in US history, if you look at it from a US point of view. COVID-19, well, this is a little bit different, and a couple of contexts here are important to understand. One is, had this happened only a couple of years ago, the pervasive shift to work from home that we're now going through would have been very, very difficult because the tech infrastructure and apps were just not ready. In fact, I could argue that people weren't quite ready for it either. So we're very lucky in that sense. The other thing to remember is we're only 6 months into this. Widespread distribution of vaccine is going to come much later, and that's what's going to define the beginning of the end of this particular crisis. But I think we have to be thinking about long-term. This isn't something that ends in weeks or months. This could have a very long tail to it. The other thing to think about is in the world around us, there's a real lack of consensus and or compliance about things like lockdowns and herd immunity and leadership strategy, social distancing, masks, preventative therapeutics, reopening protocols, and how you interpret the data. This causes a real problem because when you look at the data to try to figure out how you make business decisions, you're faced with new complications and new complexities dealing with the time sensitivity of the data and various inconsistencies in data and methodologies. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples to show you what I mean about this. Here's a map that I found from Bloomberg. This is a map of the US states. And what they're evaluating here is the data quality coming from the states regarding COVID-19. It's really interesting, 5 different levels of quality, and the US looks like a checkerboard. So you can't really depend on data being consistent state to state, and this is in the US. An example would be, imagine having to make a business decision involving the US Southwest, and you're looking at Nevada versus Arizona. Well, Nevada is low quality and Arizona is high quality. How do you make a decision when you're comparing the data from these 2 different areas? You have to start asking about the quality of the data, and it's not something we're used to doing. We're used to just picking up data from various sources and believing that it's consistent, it's comparable, it's of high quality. But now we really have to think about the data that we're using for various decisions. A little bit more on data quality. Consider this situation. Let's say that you source raw material from a foreign country and or some of your business processes are performed in a foreign country. This could be a support line, it could be development resources that you're getting from other countries. And you're faced with, how do you evaluate the new risks that you're now looking at, and what is it that you can or must do about them? And I take you through an example that illustrates the problem with the data again. I want to look at several countries. This is countries that we may have our head office in. We may be doing business with some of these countries. We may have some of our work outsourced to some of these countries. We may have manufacturing done there, or we're sourcing products from there. And I'm also going to include Spain and the world in this little bit of analysis here, just for reference. And let's go through and have a look at this. So this is a cool chart. I'm going to give the source for all these charts at the end of this little segment here, because it's a really good resource for people. But here's a chart that looks at Canada, Spain, and the world just to get us started. And this is a map of a rolling 7-day average of new COVID-19 cases per million people in a given geography after they've reached one person per million people. So that's the scale at the bottom is number of days since it reached 1. And Spain is what you'd expect of it based on what was in the news. Canada is kind of got a good curve going on. It's starting to come down. And the world is surprisingly low, but maybe it's a timing issue, maybe it's something else. But, you know, it's interesting data. This is as of April 14th. I'm going to roll the clock forward now to May 25. This is 6 weeks ago and 6 weeks later than the last chart. The dots represent where the curves were 6 weeks ago. And now have a look at what's happening with the curve. So Spain has come way down. Canada's on the long end of the backside, and the world is increasing as you might expect it would. Still kind of interesting data, but I want to start layering on some other things here to illustrate some other problems. Let's look at some other countries here. I've added Brazil, United States, United Kingdom, India, Philippines, and China. And there's a couple of things that are going to jump out here. One, Brazil is absolutely going in the wrong direction, right? Brazil is right here. It seems to be going vertical. It really causes you to wonder what's going on there. India, the interesting thing about India is they're on the map here, but there is no data for India on April 14th, which means they're late to the game in terms of when COVID's hitting there. So when you think about or look at the data for a country like India, where you might be doing some work or you might be selling some of your products, you have to think about whether or not the data is what you need right now, or is it behind the times. And then China is remarkably flat, which causes one to think, you know, is the data and what's the quality of their data? Is it outlier? Is there a problem with the data? Are they reporting properly? These are the kinds of things that start to come up. So you can't take the data at face value. I'm going to show you one more time segment here. This is now a couple of days ago. This is July 5th. There's a couple of real interesting things that jump out of here. Brazil continues to go into the wrong direction. They look like they're out of control. I had a discussion with an entrepreneur in Brazil yesterday, and I asked him about this, and he said, well, he said, the thing to know is, you should know, is the experience in Brazil is very inconsistent. There's some regions that have a lot of problems, and some regions have very little or no problem. So when you look at countrywide data, you really have to think about where in the country do we do business and what's the experience there. And then I would remind you of the data quality map that I showed you a moment ago about the US, where the data could be inconsistent within the country. So it creates some challenges for us to figure out what the data means. In the US case, well, the only way to describe that is WTF with what's going on there. We now know that many states opened up too soon, and they're starting to claw back on the reopening, and it'll be real interesting to follow this curve, especially if you're doing business in the US somewhere. And I'll look at the UK curve. This is the one at the bottom here that dips below 0, which is clearly a bit of a problem in the data. Well, I looked into this, and it turns out that there's a methodology change that happened by the people who provide the source data for the United Kingdom. So the folks who create these graphs, who are called Our World in Data, they're going to be going back and renormalizing the data, the historical data for the United Kingdom, to take into consideration the methodology change. So that blip should work its way out in a couple of days once they renormalize their database. And then lastly, I'll mention again China, that if I was doing any buying or selling in China, I'd want to dig into these numbers by region within China to really understand what's going on there and whether or not their experience is something that I should be worrying about. So just from terms of a source point of view, these come from an organization called Our World in Data. And there's the attribution that I give you. This is an excellent resource for broad and deep research data. So if you're doing any kind of country data, I encourage you to have a look at this. You can download their entire data sets. They provide visualizations, analysis, and reports. It's really quite a good website. So what did we learn from that? Well, we know that good business decisions are based on data, analysis, discussion, and process, and so on. But the current situation really requires heightened data vigilance when we are looking at the decisions that we have to make. So you got to be really careful about data timeframes. You got to be very careful of methodology changes. If you see something odd in the data, you got to dive into it, and beware of any definitional differences that might exist from one region to another. So some of the things that we have to consider when we're going through all of this. So I just want to take a moment now to summarize some of the contextual things that we've been talking about before I move on. This may be your first, second, or third global crisis, but it's not humanity's first. Historically speaking, this crisis is still very young. Decision-making inputs, data, policy, compliance, and so on are very inconsistent, so beware timeframes, methodology, and definitions. And history strongly suggests that the world will recover and eventually thrive. The key question is when, which leads us to ask ourselves, if we're fundraising, what do we need to do differently to counter a crisis in process, lasting for an indeterminate amount of time, rife with consistencies, and a world with new, dynamic, hard to predict complexities? What do we do? Well, one of the things we need to do is shift from being reactive to proactive, and I want to talk about that next. So being proactive was okay when COVID happened. Most startups and early stage companies got a pass from existing shareholders and creditors for not being fully prepared, partly because absolutely no one was fully prepared. Various people were prepared to various degrees, but you know what? There was a real big unpreparedness problem. Typical reactions by startups and early stage companies were, we shifted to work to home, we stretched the runway as much as we could. Some had to wind down, which was unfortunate, but it's what happens. Some went and did temporary pivots. Others pivoted and discovered that they have a new business as a result of this, and it's probably going to be a permanent pivot. And some were in the right place at the right time and just became a much more aggressive about selling. I think about Zoom for a moment and what's happened with Zoom since all this started. But if we got a pass for the first time, we are not going to get a pass for the next wave or waves. And I emphasize the plural about this because this could easily happen again, whether it's COVID-19 or 20 or whatever it might be. And we have to be prepared for that. So we have to shift from being reactive to proactive. I'm going to tell you a couple of things to do to do that. Step one is to embrace risk management to the same extent that you embrace cash management, building an A-team, selling, and so on. The second is you have to reevaluate and redesign your supply and demand chains, and I'll go into this in more detail in a moment. And the third is, once you do step one and step two, you have to come up with new messaging for both internal and external purposes. And I'd like to go through each of these three things now. So embracing risk management. We've always said, you've always heard cash is king, but the thing that we have to be aware of now is that risk is queen. And if you know anything about chess, the queen takes the king. So risk is crucially important. You have to explore your risks. You have to understand your risk matrix. By that, I mean looking at something like this, where you're mapping the likelihood of a risk event versus the impact of the risk event happening. There's lots of different frameworks for this. All you have to do is do a search on risk matrix on the internet, and you'll find very many frameworks. You have to develop risk mitigation plans. You have to implement them, and you have to monitor and adjust them. And what this does is allows you to step back and ask yourself, what did you learn from C19, and how do you put that in place for your business going forward? In addition, you have to learn to speak very efficiently and effectively about risks and mitigations. This does not mean that when you're talking to somebody about your risk mitigation plan, that you pull out your risk matrix and you share with them all the analysis and work that you did. It's about doing all of that work on your own in the background, and then figuring out how you talk about that at levels of detail that will be of interest to investors and others. Managing your risk is also an opportunity to improve governance. There's an organization called Creating Future Us that published a report recently called Governance Rebooted: Corporate Governance in a Disruptive Digital Age. And there's a great quote in there that says, the progression of the pandemic happened most likely in between most board meetings. By the time those boards next convened, the world was almost unrecognizable. So what this points to is an opportunity to engage your board more frequently, maybe even establish a risk committee. This is something that typically doesn't happen until a company is much more mature, but maybe now is the time to have a risk committee and engage some of your directors or potentially some of your other stakeholders on that. And more frequent committee and or board meetings is likely called for. These would be good reactions and good things for you to include in your messaging about what you're doing as a result of COVID-19. Step 2 is reevaluate, redesign your supply and demand chains. The pandemic has shined a very bright light on a couple of things. One is third-party risk. So any time that you're buying goods or services from third parties, you are increasing the risk to your company because you're dependent on how they operate and how they manage risk. Well, when you chose your suppliers, you probably determined their risk profile based on their office and standard practices. Well, now that they've moved to work from home, you have to ask yourself, have I increased my risk without even realizing it? And then there's also the supply chain dependability that has proven to be very tenuous throughout all of this. Second point is there's a lot of interest now in local sourcing, whether it's regional or domestic versus international sourcing. Business continuity risk is now supplanting price and efficiency of foreign sourcing. So decisions about where to manufacture something or where to pick up your raw materials or components, the criteria for that are changing. So that's going to put new pressures on gross margin and selling prices as you go forward. There's foreign financing. If you're dependent on foreign financing, then you're dependent on how they're responding to the pandemic. Remember the Brazil chart. Remember the US chart with the flip up that's going on in their curve. These kinds of things are what you have to consider. There's also changes to your target buyers. There's major buying pattern changes due to the security or insecurity of things like food or child and elder care or education, wealth and employment, and the impact of local happenings. So if you're selling to people somewhere else, you really have to think about what's happened in their lives as you go forward and try to put value propositions on the table. We'll talk more about that towards the end. This leads to an interesting paradox that I call the supply-demand paradox. Local sourcing creates new value propositions for local suppliers. So if you've got components or raw materials, there's going to be a distinct increase in the interest in buying from you locally. At the same time, local sourcing also heightens the barriers for selling outside your region because those regions are going to be trying to buy locally. So on one hand, it's very good. On the other hand, it increases the barriers, and it's something that you have to think about. But it also means tighter coordination between your supply chain strategy and your demand chain strategy. In other words, your manufacturing and your sales and marketing. You really have to think about what your value propositions are to those two areas because you don't want them to be in conflict. The step 3 is determining your messaging, internal and external. You have to control the narrative on this. If you're going to be going through major changes, it's not worth the risk that people are going to misinterpret what you're doing and why, which means it's critical for you to ensure that your team understands and supports decisions. You have to engage the right people in the decision-making process. The more you involve them, the better buy-in you're going to have on the decision. And you have to include a communication strategy as you deploy those decisions because you don't want people not understanding why you're doing certain big changes. You also have to think about fine-tuning your core message for specific audiences. You might say, the same core message, but you're going to say it slightly differently to customers, to partners, to existing or prospective investors, to creditors, to the press, to peers, or to desired talent. So you have to fine tune, not retune, but fine tune. So I'm going to go to a discussion break right now. This is really a discussion on context. So the kinds of things that we covered so far were data quality, shifting from reactive to proactive, risk management, governance improvement opportunities, reevaluating and redesigning supply and demand chains, supply-demand paradox, and core messaging. I'm going to just take a moment. We're going to take about 10 minutes here to be able to chat about these things before I continue and talk about pitching, what it means to pitch after COVID. So Stacey, can I?
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, you can feel free to just drop them in the chat there. You can find the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get Frank on those questions. So Don asked, what mistakes have been seen in messaging?
That's a good question, Don. Thank you. The major mistakes I see in messaging are along a couple of planes. One is too detailed. When you think about talking to people, doesn't matter whether it's investors or customers or anybody, you want to keep the message very succinct and short. Give the person you're talking to the opportunity to ask a clarifying question about the message, and now you're answering what they're interested in as opposed to you pushing too much information that you thought was interesting for them. So you're really allowing them to turn the tables. The second is simply too complex a message. You know, the work that we do, whether it's risk management or coming up with a value proposition or coming up with why an investor should invest in the company, the work that we do there is pretty intensive and can go pretty deep. But at the end of the day, we have to step back from all of that and come up with a message that is easy to consume. I hesitate saying simple because I really don't mean a simple message. I mean an easy to consume message. So it's really on those two fronts, too much detail and too difficult to consume. Thanks for the question.
Okay, I guess we'll move on. And again, if you think of questions while Frank's presenting, feel free to drop them in that chat and we'll discuss them when we get to the next Q&A.
Okay, great. So now I want to take the context that we just talked about and move on to what does it mean from a pitching point of view now that COVID has been here. Before COVID came along, if you looked at any pitch framework, and you can search on the internet for them, and I'm going to pick on my own framework as an example. If you picked any pitch framework, they really downplayed risk in the discussion. In fact, if you looked at some of the most popular kinds of frameworks for figuring out what your business is all about, lean canvas or business model canvas, the canvas itself doesn't even explicitly deal with risk. So over the years, we've become numb to the real risk of business. And it's showed itself in the pitches that we develop and give, where we really don't talk about risk. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take you through my pitch framework really quickly, and I'm going to show you how and where we ought to be talking about risk. My framework is called The Artful Science of Pitching. I really like people at the beginning to talk about three things: give a really strong introduction, give an elevator pitch to establish the business space that you're in, and describe the problem that you're solving. That gives us the opportunity to talk about what the market opportunity is if we solve this problem. It really establishes market scalability. It allows us then to move to the solution that we're bringing to the table and the value propositions, which in essence define what the mission of the company is all about. We also talk about why now. Why is now a great time for this business to be here, or a great time to invest in this business? In other words, we're establishing investment urgency or the fear of missing out. Investors when investors come to a pitch or listen to a pitch, what they're really listening for is this part right here. Everything else is kind of interesting, but this is where they really pay attention. And that is your go-to-market strategy, or as I like to call it, Vegas which stands for validate, enter, grow, and scale. This is the core of your pitch. This is where you're talking about how you're taking your solution and doing something with it to create an investable company and something that's going to provide returns or provide value to investors, whether they're looking for financial returns or social good. The next is competitive differentiation. So how and why will somebody choose you versus other choices? How do you make money and how much money are you going to make? So that's the revenue model and the projections. Followed by the team, which gives you the opportunity to establish credibility and advertise the gaps that you're trying to fill, because after all, you're raising money. So you probably want to fill some of those gaps. Then you've got your ask, which is, here's what we're looking for today to execute a portion of our go-to-market or Vegas plan that you would have talked about earlier. And then followed by a summary, which is really the 3 points that you put up to help the audience understand or remember the takeaways about your pitch. And then lastly, as important as everything else above, is Q&A. Great Q&A can rescue a bad pitch, and bad Q&A can kill a good pitch. So Q&A is extremely important. So that's the general framework. That's what people have been working on for years. Whether it's my framework or somebody else's framework, they're all similar in various ways. But you'll notice there is no risk topic here. And you might have talked about risk in various ways throughout this, depending on what your business was. But I think it's time to be explicit about risk. And I'd like to show you where I think this comes into play. I think that once you've talked about the material things about your business in terms of go-to-market and your revenue model and projections and competitive differentiation, it's time to talk about risk mitigation. There's going to be a heightened sense of what you're doing as a result of COVID by investors and customers and partners and others. And so you have to talk about it explicitly. So when you're talking about risk mitigation, it's really talking about things like, how did COVID-19 affect your business? What did you learn? But it's more deeply, going forward, what are you doing differently to reduce, as applicable, the following risks? Your go-to-market risk, your supply chain risk, your gross margin risk, your sales risk, your cash flow risk, your talent retention, and so on. There's many, many different kinds of risks that you need to consider for your business. And for those that matter for your business, you have to be able to talk about them as competently and as confidently as you talk about things like cash flow, what you're selling, the team that you're putting together, your go-to-market plans. So it elevates this whole subject of risk. And those that do this proactively are going to be a step ahead of those that don't do it proactively and are goaded by investors to say, okay, I heard your pitch, but so what has COVID meant to you and what are you doing differently? If an investor has to ask, it's already too late for you. You really have to be proactive about this. So what are some of the factors that you need to consider? Well, as you think about putting this risk plan together, we know what COVID-19 is, we think. There could be another COVID coming along, right? COVID-19 means that it was discovered in 2019. There could be a COVID-20, there could be a COVID-21, there could be variations of all these things. It could be something old, could be something new, or it could be combinations of things, right? What happens if we have an outbreak of COVID-19 and a new influenza strain this fall? What happens, right? You have to think about time frame when you're putting together your risk plan. Is this something that could happen next month or the fall or next year? Is it something that could happen without warning? Or what is that time frame? These are the kinds of things you have to consider, along with what are some other complications. We are very lucky to have gone into the COVID-19 situation with a pretty strong global economic base, very strong. What would happen if we didn't have the strength of the last economic growth cycle to support us? What happens in a perfect storm situation? We're living through some perfect storms right now. When you think about, there's the COVID-19, there's the economic downturn that's happened as a result of that. And there's various socioeconomic things that are happening locally all over the place that are creating different storms in different places. but these combinations could get much worse and the storms could be much worse. If you have roadmaps and funding in progress, and I'm thinking of product roadmaps or a hiring roadmap, or you've got funding that's on the way, or you have sales and onboarding in process, customer onboarding or talent onboarding in process, how do you deal with those in the event of something big happening? It's not going to be just as easy as starting to work from home. We have to think about all of these things in advance, and we have to be proactive, not reactive. You have to craft your overall mitigation story like you would craft all your pitch topics. Make it tight, make it meaningful, make it easy to consume, and make it memorable. You don't want to share your analysis with people. You want to share your summary of the analysis, your top line message with people. So I'm often asked, how have investor criteria changed as a result of COVID-19? So I want to talk a bit about that. The fundamentals are exactly the same as before. Investors, whether they're VCs or angels, they take a very close look at the team, the market opportunity. If you're a later stage company, they're real interested in your traction. They want to know what your go-to-market plans are. How are you different than competitors? And in particular for some investors, what's the ROI outlook that you present to them? If they're investing in you, they're probably thinking to themselves, can I get a 10x return from this company? Can I get my money back in 5 to 10 years? And then a fit with thesis. This is particularly true of VCs who have more formal theses than angels would, but do you fit? So those fundamentals are still in place. Where things become different is exactly what we've been talking about, is what's your risk mitigation plan? So they're going to be much more interested going forward in what your plans are. And the bottom line, like always, investors look for quality. Their definition of quality now has an added element, which is risk mitigation. So it really is as simple as that to be able to figure out how you start having a stronger pitch going forward. So I want to now bridge for a moment to pitching to customers, partners, and talent. What's different about pitching to them versus pitching to investors? Because I've been mainly talking about investors so far. And when you look at investors for a moment, look, essentially what you're doing when you're pitching is you're talking about the long-term investment and or social value to that investor. In other words, it's a value proposition statement. So what about the other types of pitches? Well, if you're pitching to prospective buyers, right, you're selling to somebody, you have to address what's important to them, whether it's solving a specific problem, an ROI opportunity for them, timeliness, and so on. If you're pitching to potential partners, what is your unique and compelling, mutually beneficial offer in exchange for partnership terms? And if you're trying to hire somebody, what are the reasons that they should work with you versus the other choices they have? And these are going to be things like company culture, the role that they have, the long-term comp, the vision, the industry, the challenge, those kinds of things. But when you look at all of those, each target of your pitch is now going to have a very heightened awareness and interest in how you're mitigating the risk of your value proposition offer. So let's think about a partner, a potential partner, for example. Let's say you put a value proposition on the table that talks about how you're going to go after a market together. And it's for mutually beneficial. They're naturally now going to say to you, okay, I get it, it's a good plan, but what happens if and when the following things happen, right? How are you dealing with that? I know how I'm dealing with it. How are you dealing with it? They're all going to be very interested in risk. And if they're not already asking, they will be very soon. And as I mentioned earlier, fine tune your standard risk mitigation message for each audience. You're not going to say the same things to an investor that you might say to a client or a partner or talent and vice versa. You really got to think about how you fine tune the core message. A couple of final thoughts. It's said that all politics are local. And I've concluded by going through some of this research, absolutely so are pandemics. If you look at what's happened in a pandemic, you've got the cause, in this case, it's COVID-19. You've got various responses that are happening federally and regionally, which could be a municipality, down to a municipality, and the economic fallout of those choices. But those two things get complicated by local socioeconomic factors. And these are the kinds of things you have to think about as you go forward working with suppliers or buyers. That when you're selling to them, it's not just about what you're experiencing as a result of COVID. It's not just about what you're experiencing or reading about that deals with federal or regional responses. You really have to think about their local environment. This is not so much true of mass market kind of opportunities, but if you've got some key clients, significant clients or significant suppliers, you really have to start looking at things through their eyes to understand it. This graphic is kind of what I just said. You're at the top, your suppliers in the bottom left, your buyers are in the bottom right. And as you put your pitch together, which includes your value proposition, your risk management, and everything else you need to talk about for that given situation, you really have to think about the local factors that are influencing those folks and their ability to partner with you, buy from you, and so on. It's very important to see your buyers and sellers situations through their eyes as you go forward. With that, I'm done my content. We're now on our next discussion break for Q&A, and Stacy, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yeah, so again, if you have any questions for Frank about the pitching or any part of this presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat. So Peter says, has there been a slowdown in investment in Canada, and do you expect to see it stay slow, or is it opening up a bit now?
That's a good question, Peter. Thank you. There has been a slowdown, but it's not all entirely because of COVID. We're now in the summertime, and summertime is traditionally a slower time for investment. Will it be slow this summer? I don't know. Maybe there's going to be a bit of a bubble that works through the system, and there'll be some investment later. But here's a broader view on this. It's not just about slowness. I want you to think about different types of investors that are out there. Think about angels for a moment. Angels are very sensitive to the stock market. In a bull market, they will invest more. In a bear market, they start pulling back on their investments. They're sensitive to major events as well. So when the stock market took a very bad hit near the start of COVID, I know that there were lots of investors who started, angel investors who started double thinking about whether or not they were going to continue with their plans. And in fact, I'm aware of various deals that didn't happen, valuations that were cut in half, deals that were just simply pulled off the table, or smaller amounts that were offered. But generally speaking, in what I'm seeing, angels are continuing to have their meetings. They're continuing to go through their filter, their selection processes, due diligence meetings, or deals are coming forward. You'll see in the news every so often about some of the major deals that are closed. So they're still there. Just a little bit slower, a little bit tougher, and due diligence absolutely is hinging in part on, so what's your risk mitigation strategy? VCs are a little bit different. If a VC has a funded fund, it means they have money in the bank and that money needs to find a home. So they are constantly looking for opportunities. They're going to be leaning first in general to follow-ups that their existing portfolio companies need. It's true of angels as well, by the way. But they're also looking for new places to place money. And it comes back to what I said earlier about quality is very, very important. So they're still looking at companies. They're still looking at quality like they've always had. They've probably heightened the bar a little bit in terms of where they're investing, but it's still happening. Now, if a VC was about to raise a fund, I would suggest that they probably are having a little bit more difficulty than usual in getting that money to create that fund. So the next wave of funds might be a bit slow coming, but generally that's what I see.
Okay, Dawn had asked, why do you think so many pitchers have ignored risk factors? Um, and
That's
how,
a
yeah.
that's a terrific question. It's because we became complacent over time. If you go back to 2007, 2008 during the financial crisis, I assure you that investments that were done shortly after 2008, there was a heightened awareness and interest in financial risk of any company that was being looked at. But over time, that interest in risk started to wane because things were going well, the economy was booming, things were going up and to the right. There were lots of good opportunities coming along. Investors became very interested in the stories, the problems, the go-to-market strategies, and risk kind of fell off the map. So this has been a wake-up call for us to say, you know what? You can't forget risk. And so it's not really that difficult to put risk on the table, and I predict it's not going to fall off the table after this. The financial crisis of 2007, 2008, yes, it was global, but it wasn't pandemic. It didn't affect everybody. This particular situation affects just about everybody. So I think this is going to cause some deep-rooted changes going forward, the kinds of changes that I've been talking about. And I think that's why risk will come back and stay here. Thanks for the question. I like that question.
So Michael is coming from a med tech startup with some regulatory constraints, just to give that kind of background. He's got some clinical trial uncertainties. So his question was, if risk concerns have been heightened, doesn't this imply a tougher environment for investments with a longer ROI?
So I would say yes on the tougher, but it's tougher for everybody. So on a relative basis, you're still competing against others for investment. Now, in your particular industry, is it tougher than somebody else selling in other industries? Well, it may or may not be, but on the other hand, in your space, you also have some benefits that are going to come from this, because I think regulations are going to change for the better as a result of all of this. And they're still going to have to balance risk when it comes to what happens with the regulations themselves. But I think there's going to be an interest in more innovation and faster results.
Great, Frank, thank you. Katie is asking, how do you position a pivot in a deck? Is it too early to pitch investors if you are in the validation stage of this pivot?
It's really difficult to answer that on a general basis. It really depends on the specific situation, but I'll give you a general type of answer that you might be able to apply to your situation. So pivots in general are very difficult to pitch because it forces you to talk about what life was like in the business or what the business was like pre the pivot, which is generally not a great place to be because you presumably pivoted for a very difficult reason. So my advice usually to people is don't talk about the past, don't talk about why you pivoted, just talk about the business as it is today. Remember, when we're pitching to somebody, it's for the purpose of getting them to want to learn more and sit down with you and eventually take you to due diligence. That's when the background information about how you got to this pivot and what happened should come out. It's when you're having a face-to-face dialogue. It's when you could read each other's body language. It's when there's a bit of a relationship that existed. The complication in that answer comes from companies that were out there pitching and have suddenly had to make a pivot. And now they have to be out there talking about what's different about the company now versus what I was saying last week or last month. And that's difficult, but in that case, we have to kind of set the stage to say, this is where we were last month, this is what happened, this is where we are now, this is how we're going forward. And you do this in as positive a way as possible. De-emphasize the bad part of the story and overemphasize, if you have to, the good part of the story without being too hyperbolic.
Okay, Peter was asking, given your comment about the summer being slow, if one were to want to start looking for funds, do you think they should wait for September? And his follow-up to that was whether the thinking differs for ed tech based on the focus on online learning.
Well, let me start with ed tech for a moment. So in ed tech, if you're selling to school boards or colleges, universities, or to government areas, you have to think about what their fiscal plan is, fiscal year is. And if you're not selling until late summer or the fall, you've probably already missed a big opportunity. So you have to think long in advance about how and when you're selling. I would not wait. I would absolutely be going forward now. This is true of investment as well. It can take easily 4 to 6 months to close any kind of investment. So the earlier you start, the better. Even if it's difficult to reach people in the summertime, everybody's getting more and more used to working virtually. So you're going to be able to probably reach a few more people. You have to lay the groundwork. You have to follow a process. You have to let the process unfold itself, because in part you're not, at some point you no longer become in control of it. It's in control by the investors who are trying to figure out when they're going to close. And so the earlier you start, the better. So I would definitely not wait.
So Bob says, in light of COVID-19, how important are collaboration, partnerships, and companies' initiatives in the tech ecosystem community within the ecosystem for pitching?
I can interpret that a couple of different ways. So one is, let's say you're part of Communitech or any other innovation center or accelerator. Do you cite those? The answer generally is yes, but you don't make a big deal of it, because investors at the end of the day, that's not the kind of information they really are looking for. So it doesn't help greatly. However, I think working within the ecosystem and taking advantage of the kinds of programs that Communitech and other areas offer is absolutely fundamental and should be part of everybody's plans. You need to be able to tap into the resources that are available and use them to the fullest advantage you can, whether it's the opportunity to rehearse a pitch with somebody and get some feedback, or develop the pitch, or figure out what a sales pitch needs to look like, or we're having a lot of trouble with our sales funnel right now because most of our business is in a geography that's been swamped by COVID-19. What are we going to do about it? That's not a sales funnel problem. That's a deeper problem that requires some more brains. So I think participating in the ecosystem is absolutely necessary. And I think companies that don't are really missing out on a great opportunity.
Great. So I think, Frank, basically your point is that participating in the ecosystem is great for your business, but maybe not super relevant to the investors in your pitch.
Not in the sense of saying, putting up logos of all the programs you've been part of. I mean, if you've done that, you've heard an investor say, yeah, okay, but so what? Right. It's not what I'm here for.
Okay, so the next question actually was just a bit more of a restate. So you had mentioned earlier about funds, if they've recently closed a fund, they're still looking to deploy that. So they just wanted a repeat on that.
If a VC has a fund that has money in the bank, they are going to be looking for places to put that money, because they are unable to meet their investment promises to their investors with money that's sitting in the bank. So they have to place that money in places. They have to place their bets, so to speak. But when they place their bets, they are constantly asking themselves, is this a company that's going to give me the kind of ROI return that I need to deliver ROI to my investors? Is this a company with a potential exit that's going to matter to me? Does this company fit my investment thesis? For those reasons, they're always looking for quality. So if there's money in the bank, there's money out there to be had, and quality becomes important. If they're about to raise a fund and it's not yet funded, then I would suggest, I don't have data on this, I would just suggest that they are going to have a bit of trouble raising their funds on a timeline that they're used to. If they used to take 3 months to raise a fund, now it might take 4 or 5. If they used to take 6 months, now it might take 7 or 8. These are just, wild ass guesses. But that's the difference. If they have money, they'll invest. If they don't, it's going to take a little while.
That's great, Frank. Thanks for that clarification. So I think we've reached about our time. We wanted to thank everybody for joining us for our Ask Me Anything session today. I hope we were able to cover all your questions. We also want to thank Frank for presenting. It was great to have him with us and great to see all of you here. We run these sessions every Thursday with different topics, so we hope to see you in an upcoming session, maybe next week or in one of the following weeks.
And I want to give my thanks to everybody for coming in today and participating and the questions. And Stacy, thank you for moderating, and Mackenzie in the background, thank you for arranging. And it's good. I hope to see everybody at some point.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Stay healthy.